Well, it's an interesting divergence at play here. You have in the Philippines clearly signals that the central banks will want to raise interest rates because inflation is starting to move higher. But yet at the same time, you have in Indonesia, the governor in particular, making very dovish statements and indicating that perhaps it's not quite the time yet to raise interest rates. Now, in both cases, it'd probably be good if interest rates rise sooner rather than later, because neither economy can shield itself from those inflation pressures. You mentioned oil, of course, being a driver here, but it's a much broader issue stretching from food into core inflation as well. Therefore, we would expect both central banks to hike interest rates, even though in Indonesia, the governor has really signaled a very dovish bent going into today's meeting.
Yeah, I want to take a look at the Indonesian just a little bit, but first the BSP. And you might say that it's a bit of a dovish hike on the part of the BSP. Their incoming governor, Felipe Medalla, saying that he's averse to doing 50 basis point rate hikes. He wants to be a little bit more gradual. It's interesting, though, because the issue facing some of these central banks is, on one hand, you don't want to stifle economic growth. But the Philippines, as we saw, their economy growing by more than 8% in the first quarter. Is this a case of them perhaps having more room to actually throw things at inflation, or is there still much of a catch-up in terms of in economic growth that the Philippines needs, hence why the BSP is staying a little bit more dovish with their rate hikes?
Well, remember, the Philippines had a big decline in economic output in 2020, only gradually catching up last year. And though we have 8% growth in the first quarter, this is really just starting to narrow the output gap. And therefore, the Philippines is really in a position, well, yes, they have to raise interest rates, but they don't have to slam the brakes, because underlying, in terms of the underlying factors in the economy, you still have that slack in terms of labor market. And therefore, gradual tightening is probably more likely. 50 basis points would be a bit too aggressive today, but 25 basis points, moving gradually step by step, is probably the way to go. Also to anchor inflation expectations, signaling to consumers that the BSP is on top of things, that will not stand by as inflation continues to push higher.